$700. One number handwritten on a clean white sheet laid on the workbench like a verdict. Claire Novak called it fair rust on the frame, the wrong transmission papers that didn't add up. Across from her, Joel Carver never looked up from his wrench. Under a gray tarp gone soft with 8 years of dust, a red Corvette waited in the far corner, the one thing in that garage he had never let a soul see. Joel didn't argue. He didn't bargain. He set the paper down and turned back to the engine, and his silence pressed harder than any shout. And yet he had pulled back the tarp himself on purpose. The garage stood at the edge of Richmond, Virginia, where the road gave up its asphalt for gravel, and the gravel gave up on going much of anywhere at all. It was a low building of corrugated steel, older than the man who ran it, and on most mornings, the only sound inside was an engine being asked the same question again and again until it finally answered. Joel Carver worked alone, and he liked it that way. He was 55, his knuckles scarred over, and the nails dark at the edges, no matter how he scrubbed them, and he kept no radio on the bench. No music. Nothing that might sit between him and the thing he was always listening for. A lifter gone loose, a bearing beginning to dry out. He could find the fault in a motor, the way other men found a misspelled word on a page, and he stayed with it long past the point where the money made any sense, because a job left half finished kept him awake at night, in a way an empty bank account never did. He was 3 months behind on the rent for the building. The landlord had called twice that week, and twice Joel had let the phone ring itself, quiet against the steel of the bench while he worked. It wasn't that he had no answer. It was that the answer wasn't ready yet, and Joel did not hand over things that weren't ready. In the far corner, beneath a gray tarp, gone soft with 8 years of dust, sat the one object in the garage he never touched and never explained. A 1969 Corvette. The car had belonged to Walter Finch, and Walter Finch had been the nearest thing to a father Joel ever had, an old engine man who taught him that a motor would tell the truth if you were only quiet enough to let it. When Walter died in 2019, he left Joel 2 things and nothing else: the keys to that Corvette and a single sentence with no instructions attached to it. When you understand why it matters, you'll know what to do. 8 years on, Joel still did not understand. So the tarp stayed where it was, and the car stayed under it. And on his worst nights, Joel let himself believe that not knowing was the same as not yet having to decide. Then, on a September morning, a silver sedan he didn't recognize rolled onto the gravel and stopped. The woman who stepped out of it wore a tailored blazer that had no business in a place like his, and she carried a tablet and a leather portfolio, the way some people carried a badge. She introduced herself as Claire Novak from Apex Motor Group and said she was there about the Corvette. Joel did not ask how she knew the car was there. That was the first strange thing, though Claire would not understand it as strange until much later. He simply set down his wrench, crossed the floor, and drew the tarp back himself. He had not let a single person look at that car in 8 years. He let her look now. Claire was good at her work, and her work was to make a number feel like a fact. She circled the Corvette, slowly photographing it from 8 angles, and as she moved, she narrated its flaws the way a doctor reads a chart aloud, rust creeping along the frame, a transmission that wasn't original to the car paperwork, that didn't quite add up. Every observation was true. Every one of them quietly lowered the figure she had not yet said. Joel watched her do it, and something turned over in him that he could not put a name to. For 8 years, the car had been a sealed room inside his own head, and now a stranger stood in the middle of that room, with a tablet reading it back to him, fitting a price to it. He had expected to hate the feeling. Instead, he found himself listening to her, the way he listened to an engine waiting to hear what she would say the car was worth, because some buried part of him wanted to know the answer just as badly as she pretended she did not. When she finished, she wrote a single number on a clean white sheet and laid it on the workbench between them. $700. She called it fair, and she said the word, the way she'd said all the others, like it was simply the next true thing on the chart. Joel looked at the paper. He looked at the car. He looked at Claire. Then he set the paper down, walked back to the Mustang waiting on the lift, and said nothing at all. The quiet that followed was not the quiet of a man thinking over an offer. It was the quiet of a man who had already moved on to something that mattered more, and it unsettled Claire more than any argument could have. She gathered her tablet and went outside to make a call. On the gravel with the morning still cool, she called Doug Merritt. He was her supervisor at Apex, and he answered on the second ring, the way he always did, as though he'd been sitting with the phone in his hand, waiting. She told him the man hadn't countered, hadn't argued, hadn't so much as looked insulted. Doug gave a low, satisfied sound on the other end. That was the whole idea, he told her. The 700 was never meant to be taken. It was meant to sit. A number that low set down in front of a man already 3 months behind on his rent didn't need to be accepted on the spot. It only had to live in his head right there beside the bills until the arithmetic finished the job on its own. Give it a week, Doug said. 2, maybe. He'll call. They always call. And then he was gone, the line dead before she could answer. Claire stood on the gravel with the phone still warm against her ear. She had heard him say things like that before. She had even repeated them herself to other sellers in other towns, and never once felt the floor tilt the way it tilted now. Through the garage window she could see Joel bent over the Mustang, unhurried, his shoulders loose, as if the $700 on his bench had already stopped existing. He did not look like a man doing math. He looked like a man holding something she had not managed to price, something that hadn't appeared anywhere in her notes, on any of the 8 photographs in any column of the appraisal. That was when the question arrived uninvited on a gravel lot at the edge of Richmond. She had closed 9 deals in 14 months. She had been good at it, and proud of being good at it. And not once in all that time had she stopped to ask herself the thing she asked now. What exactly was she doing here? Her car sat a few feet away. The door was unlocked. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to slide behind the wheel drive back the way she'd come and let the number do its slow work the way Doug said it would. That was the job. That had always been the job. She looked through the glass again. Joel had reached for a smaller wrench without lifting his eyes from the motor, his hand finding it on the bench, by memory, the way a man reaches for something in his own home in the dark. There was a kind of certainty in it that had nothing to do with money, and Claire realized she had been sent here to take something from a man who clearly already knew its worth better than she ever would, and that the $700 wasn't a price at all. It was a test of how little he'd accept before the bills broke him. She put the phone in her pocket, and she stayed. She did not yet know what she meant to do by staying, only that getting into the car felt for the first time in 14 months like the wrong move. So she stood in the cool September light a little longer, watching a stranger work, and waited for the morning to tell her what came next. It would not be long. Out on the road, still a few minutes away, a truck was already coming. The truck came off the road, slow, a gray Ram 1500 towing a small enclosed trailer, and it stopped on the gravel a careful distance from Claire's sedan, the way a man parks when he isn't sure yet whether he's welcome. 2 men climbed down. Neither hurried. Claire, still standing in the cool light where she'd put her phone away, watched them cross the lot and felt the morning shift under her without knowing why. The taller of the 2 stopped a few feet from the open bay and looked past her into the dim of the garage to the corner where the tarp had been folded back. He was somewhere in his 60s, lean with a stillness to him that made the space around him feel smaller. The other man was heavier, older, his forearms thick from a lifetime of the same work Joel did, and he carried a worn canvas bag over one shoulder, like it weighed nothing and meant everything. The tall one spoke first, and not to her. "It's still here," he said, and the 3 words came out soft, with the weight of a thing a man has been looking for so long he'd half stopped believing he'd find it. Joel set down his wrench. He came to the mouth of the bay, wiping his hands on a rag, and he looked the two strangers over, the way he looked at everything slowly, without offering anything first. The tall man introduced himself as Stuart Hale. The name landed in the garage and seemed to take up room. Claire knew it before he finished saying it. Anyone who'd spent a year reading provenance files and auction histories knew it. 2 championships in historic GT, racing back-to-back 1987 and 1989, in an era when the sport still ran. The old cars hard, and the men who won did it with their hands as much as their nerve. The heavier man was Bert Calloway, and Stuart said it the way you name a thing everyone in a certain world already respects 31 years. Building race engines, most of them for cars, whose names had outlived the men who drove them. They had not come to buy anything. Stuart made that plain in the first breath. They'd come because word had reached them the way word does in a small trade, that someone was out here trying to take this particular car off a man's hands for scrap money. Claire's stomach turned over. She understood standing there exactly how that word had traveled. 3 weeks back, Apex had reached out to a broker down in Atlanta. Quiet background work, the kind Doug ordered when he wanted to know what a thing was really worth before he pretended it was worth nothing. She hadn't thought about it since. But a broker who handles cars like this one knows the people who love cars like this one, and a phone call asking the wrong question in the wrong tone is its own kind of announcement. The same call that had gone out to price the Corvette had told the racing world it still existed. Bert had already crossed to the car. He set his canvas bag on the bench, unbuckled it, and drew out a photograph, black and white, soft at the corners, from years of handling. He held it up so the light from the bay door fell across it. A red Corvette on a racetrack, the number 24 painted on its door, the paddock blurred behind it. Stamped in the white border in faded ink was a date, the 2nd of February 1987. He turned the photograph toward the car in the corner, and then toward Joel, and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. The shape in the photograph and the shape under the swept-back tarp were the same shape. Same car. Same number ghosted now under a coat of red that Walter had laid down himself a long time ago. Joel looked at the photograph for a long moment. Whatever moved in him didn't reach his face. Bert handed the photo to Stuart and turned to the Corvette. He lifted the hood with the ease of a man who had lifted that exact hood before in another life and bent over the engine bay. He didn't reach for a light. He didn't check anything against a sheet. He read the casting numbers off the block aloud from memory, the way another man might recite an old phone number, and then he began naming the work, this manifold ported by hand, and not by any catalog spec. This distributor advanced past what the book allowed, because the book had never sat at a track at night and listened to what the motor actually wanted. None of it was documented. None of it had ever gone out to a machine shop. Walter Finch hadn't trusted paper. He'd trusted the sound an engine made when it was right, and he'd built this one entirely by that sound. "There's no record of any of this," Bert said, straightening up, one hand still resting on the fender. "There never was. He did it all in a garage just like this one with nobody watching." He looked at Joel, then something careful in it. "Almost nobody." Joel left the bay without a word. When he came back, he was carrying a logbook, thick, its cover gone dark and greasy with handling the spine cracked from being opened 1,000 times. He held it out to Bert. Bert took it like it was something that might break. He turned the pages slowly, and he found the one he was looking for, the way you find a page you've thought about for years, without ever having seen it. He read aloud, and his voice came down lower as he did. The entry was dated the 31st of January 1987, the night before that photograph was taken. Joel stayed till 2 in the morning. Nobody asked him to. This one hears things I can't hear anymore. The garage went still in a different way than before. Claire had stepped just inside the bay without deciding to, and she stood there holding what she'd just heard. The boy in that 40-year-old entry, and the man with the rag in his hand, were the same person. Joel hadn't been a caretaker who'd inherited a car. He'd been there. He'd been there the night before, the race that started one of the 2 championships everyone in the trade still spoke about. A 15-year-old kid kneeling in the dark beside an old man who couldn't hear the high notes of his own engine anymore, and who'd found a boy who could. "He kept you off the record on purpose," Stewart said, watching Joel. "The whole crew knew he had someone he worked with apart from the rest of us. None of us ever knew it was you. He wanted it that way." Something that was almost a smile crossed his face and didn't stay. "He used to say the car didn't need 2 names on it to be true." Joel didn't confirm it and didn't deny it. He took the logbook back from Bert, closed it, and held it against his side, and that was answer enough. Bert reached into the canvas bag again and brought out a laptop scarred and slow to wake. He set it on the bench beside the $700 sheet, which still lay there exactly where Claire had left it, and he turned the screen so Joel could see. An auction lot dated 2021, a C3 Corvette. No documentation, no chain of ownership anyone could prove sold, for $290,000. "That one was a guess," Bert said. "A nice guess. Somebody paid $290,000 for a story they couldn't back up." He tapped the edge of the laptop and looked at the car in the corner. "This one isn't a guess. Full documentation, complete chain of ownership every hand had ever passed through. The only surviving car from that championship season, with the man's own logbook to prove what's under the hood." He let it sit a second. "It goes to a real auction. The floor doesn't open under $380,000. The ceiling, I wouldn't want to guess. The number filled the garage, and it should have changed the temperature of the room. $380,000 set down on a bench in front of a man 3 months behind on his rent." Claire watched Joel's face for the thing she'd seen on 100 faces, the small, involuntary brightening, the arithmetic starting. It didn't come. What crossed Joel instead looked closer to confusion, almost to pain. The bigger the number got, the further it seemed to carry him from something. Claire didn't understand it then, but she understood that the figure on Bert's screen hadn't answered any question Joel was asking. It had made the question larger. Whatever he had been trying to work out for 8 years under that tarp, $380,000 did not solve it. If anything, it sat on his chest like a weight. Into that, a second car arrived. It was a black sedan, polished, and the man who got out of it wore a suit that hadn't been bought anywhere near Richmond. Claire knew the watch on his wrist before she'd fully turned around. She'd seen it across enough conference tables, and she knew with a small, cold drop in her gut exactly how Doug Merritt had found this place. The company tracked the location of its people through the devices it handed them. He hadn't needed her to call him back. He'd watched the little dot on a map stop moving and stay stopped, and he'd come to see why. Doug came up the gravel with his easy salesman's stride, and he was 3 steps into the bay before he saw Stuart Hale standing by the car. It took him exactly 1 second to put his professional face back together, but Claire was watching, and she caught the second before he did. The 2 older men knew each other. It was in the half nod Doug gave and the way Stuart didn't return it. "Stuart," Doug said, recovering pleasant. "Been a while. The Amelia sale, wasn't it?" Stuart said nothing to that, and the silence made Doug talk faster. He turned to Joel and dropped all the slow patience the $700 had been built on, because the slow play was dead the moment a 2-time champion put his hands on the fender. "Let's stop wasting the morning," Doug said. $50,000, right now today." And then before the number had finished settling in the very same breath, 80,000 cash, and I drive that trailer out of here this afternoon. The jump told the whole story by itself. A man does not climb from $700 to 80,000 in one breath, unless he has known all along what the thing was worth, and Claire heard it land that way in the room. Stuart almost smiled again. Bert just folded his arms. Doug felt the room move against him, and he changed his voice. He brought it down, made it warm, made it the voice of a friend, doing a hard man, a quiet favor. "Be realistic, Joel," he said. "You're 3 months behind on this building. I know that. I can make that disappear with a single check today, and you walk away clean with money in your pocket on top of it." He spread his hands, reasonable, almost gentle. "This is business. There's nothing personal in it." Joel looked at him for a while. Then he crossed to the workbench at the back, not the one with the sheet of paper on it, the other one against the wall, and he opened the middle drawer. He took out a white envelope, plain, slightly bowed from sitting in a drawer too long. He carried it back and set it on the bench in front of Doug. He did not hand it to him. He set it down and took his hand away. 3 months, Joel said. "Count it out. It's been sealed since the week before she first drove out here." Claire felt the floor move again. The envelope had been ready before any of this started. Before her appraisal, before the photographs, before the $700. While Doug had been measuring how long it would take a desperate man to break, the man had already had the rent in a drawer sealed and waiting. "I don't need you to solve my problem," Joel said. His voice never rose. "I never did." He looked at Doug, and then briefly at Claire, and he told them the rest of it plainly the way he told a customer what was actually wrong with their car, instead of what they hoped was wrong. 3 weeks ago, a broker out of Atlanta had called him. The man had been asked by Apex to dig up quiet background on the car, what it was, what it might bring, who held it, and how hard he could be pushed. The broker hadn't liked the smell of it. He'd turned the work down, and then he'd done something Doug hadn't counted on. He'd picked up the phone and warned Joel. So Joel had known before Claire ever turned onto his gravel that the company was coming. He'd known the $700 for exactly what it was the moment it touched his bench. Not an offer, a tool, a number low enough to live in a man's head and rot. "That's why the rent's in the envelope," Joel said. "Not to prove I've got it, to take it off the table. So whatever I decide about that car, I decide it for the only reason that's ever been worth anything to me, and not because a man in a good suit had his hand around my throat." And then Claire understood the thing she had been circling all morning. She understood why a man who'd known it was a trap had pulled the tarp back himself and let a stranger photograph the one thing he'd never shown a soul. For 8 years, Joel hadn't known what to do with the car. Walter had left him a sentence and no instructions. When you understand why it matters, you'll know what to do. And Joel had never understood, so he'd never acted, and the tarp had stayed down. When Apex came, he could have turned them away at the road. Instead, he'd let them in. He'd let the outside world walk into the sealed room and put a number on the thing, because he'd hoped that seeing how the world valued it might finally tell him what it was. The $700 trap had been ugly and small, but the door he opened to it had let in the 2 men now standing by the car, the only 2 people left alive who could tell him the truth he'd been waiting 8 years to hear. He hadn't planned that. He'd only left the door open, and the answer had walked through it. Stewart spoke, and there was no heat in it at all, which made it worse for Doug than any anger could have. "You know what that car's worth," he said. "You've known the whole time. You came out here and put $700 in front of the man who built it." He let that stand. "Call that whatever you want to call it." Doug looked at Claire. It was a short look, but Claire knew everything it asked of her. "Back me. Pick a side. Remember who signs the check." She looked down at the concrete floor, at the old oil stains worn into it at the toe of her own shoe that had no business in a place like this. Then she looked up. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The look she gave him back was its own answer, and Doug read it the way he read everything fast and cold. He picked the envelope up off the bench, weighed it once in his hand, as if he might say something about it, and set it down again. He buttoned his jacket. Whatever he'd planned to walk out of here with, he understood now he wasn't going to get it, and that the longer he stayed, the smaller he'd look in front of a man whose name still meant something in rooms Doug only visited. "You're making a mistake," he said to Joel to the room to no one. It came out thin. He turned and walked back down the gravel to the black sedan. The door shut behind him, not a slam, just the ordinary heavy sound of a well-made door closing on a well-made car. Somehow, that was worse. A slam would have been a man losing his temper. This was a man closing an account. The sedan backed around and was gone, and the dust it lifted hung in the September light and slowly came back down. Inside the garage, no one moved for a while. The $700 sheet still lay on the bench where Claire had set it down hours ago in another version of the morning, when she'd still believed she knew what she'd come here to do. Bert quietly closed the laptop. Stuart hadn't taken his eyes off Joel, and Joel stood with the logbook still pressed against his side and looked at the car in the corner, uncovered now, in full light, for the first time in 8 years, with 2 men who'd known its true name standing beside it, and Claire saw on his face that whatever he'd been waiting to understand, he was very close to it now, and that it was going to cost him more than any number on any bench. Bert opened the logbook again. He didn't go looking this time. He went straight to the last entry he meant to read, like a man who'd carried the page number in his head for years. When he found it, he didn't lift his voice the way he had before. He brought it down almost to nothing, the way you read something at a graveside. The entry was dated the 1st of February, 1987, the night before Daytona, the night before the photograph. If this car finishes first tomorrow, it's because of the hours this kid put in tonight. Nobody paid him. Nobody asked him to count the hours. Bert closed the book gently and rested his hand flat on the cover. Stuart was looking at Joel, and when he spoke, it was quiet and certain, with none of the showmanship a lesser man might have reached for. He kept it separate because he wanted to protect you, he said. Not from us. From this. His eyes went briefly to the $700 sheet still lying on the bench, then back. From the part of the world that puts a number on a thing and thinks that's the same as knowing it. He figured if your name was never on the car, nobody could ever take it from you or sell it or talk you out of what it was. He left the car out of the record so the truth would stay yours. Something went out of Joel then, slowly, like air leaving a tire over a long, quiet day. He set the back of his hand against the fender of the Corvette and leaned on it, and his head came down. And for a moment, he didn't look like a man who could fix anything. He turned his face away from the 3 of them toward the wall, where the morning light didn't reach, and he stayed that way while he got his breathing back under him. It was the most any of them had seen him give. For 8 years, Joel had not let himself believe the one thing he most needed to be true. That he hadn't only kept the car, that he had belonged to it, that the most important man in his life had believed in him completely and had written it down in his own hand on the night before the biggest race of his life and meant it. Walter had never said those words out loud while he was alive. He'd said them to a logbook where Joel was never meant to find them until he was ready, and a stranger had just read them into the air of the garage, and they had landed on Joel with the full weight of every year he'd spent under that tarp, not knowing whether any of it had been real. It had been real. Here were 2 men who'd carried the proof 300 miles to give it back to him, and in that moment, Joel finally understood the sentence Walter had left him, the one with no instructions. When you understand why it matters, you'll know what to do. He understood it now. The car didn't matter because of what it would bring on a floor in front of men with paddles. It mattered because it was the last surviving proof that Walter Finch had existed and had believed in people the world never bothered to write down and had been right to. That was the why, and with the why in his hands, the what came to him as simply as the next turn of a wrench. He straightened up. He wiped his hand on the rag out of pure habit, though there was nothing on it, and he turned to Stuart. "Then it shouldn't be under a tarp," Joel said. His voice had come back level. "And it shouldn't go to anybody who'd put it under one." He told Stuart he would sell him the car. Not under its worth the way Doug had wanted, and not as a favor the way some men in Joel's place might have tried to dress it up. He'd take the true number for it, the floor Bert had named, and whatever rose above that, because the lesson had never been that money was the enemy. The lesson was that the reason had to be clean. Turning down $700 from a man who'd have flipped the car into a polished lie, and then taking $380,000 from a man who'd keep it honest, were not two different principles. They were the same one seen from both sides. He laid down 3 conditions, and he laid them down, plainly no room to misread. The car would be shown in public, not locked in a private collection to gather value in the dark. Stewart's name still opened doors at the Racing Heritage Foundation, and a car like this, with its full chain of ownership intact, belonged where people could stand in front of it. Second, Walter Finch's name would come first, on everything, every placard, every line of provenance, every word written about it. Not Joel's, not Stewart's. Walter's at the top, where it had never been allowed to sit while the man was alive. And third, nothing on the car would be touched. No restoration, no fresh paint, no buffing it back to something it had never been. It would be shown exactly as it was. Stewart heard all 3 and gave a single nod. Walter would have thrown us both out of here for suggesting anything else, he said, and for the first time that morning, the smile he gave was one he let stay. The money would clear the 3 months of rent, and more than that, it would keep the garage open and the lights on and the lift working for as many years as Joel had left in his hands. But that was the consequence, not the cause, and Joel had proven which was which an hour earlier when he'd set a sealed envelope on the bench in front of a man trying to buy his desperation. The rent had been handled before any of this began. The car was a separate thing. He'd never let the 2 touch, and he didn't let them touch now. Claire came back the following Tuesday. She came without the blazer, without the tablet, without the leather portfolio that had made her look like she was carrying a badge. She'd handed in her resignation at Apex the week before, quietly the day after she'd driven away from the garage the first time, and found she couldn't stop thinking about a man who reached for a wrench in the dark by memory. She had come back to write the car's real story for one of the trade magazines that still ran long pieces for people who cared. Joel gave her one condition for it, and it was the same one he'd given Stewart. Walter Finch's name had to be the first thing in the piece, the very first. "That's the reason I'm writing it," Claire told him, and she meant it in a way she hadn't meant much of anything in 14 months. What happened to Doug Merritt happened the way things happen in small trades, without an announcement, but not without a cause. Stewart Hale's name still carried weight in rooms Doug only ever visited as a guest, and Stewart made a few calls in the days after. Within a week, 3 of the long-term consulting contracts Apex had been counting on were quietly allowed to lapse. Not long after the company opened an internal review of its acquisitions practices, not over $700, which on its own meant nothing but over the shape that $700 had exposed once someone went looking, including the matter of how a supervisor had tracked an employee's movements in real time, watching where she went and how long she stayed without her ever being told. The number had been small. The pattern under it was not. Joel spent 4 days getting the car ready to travel. He didn't restore it. He'd told Stewart he wouldn't, and he wouldn't have anyway. He cleaned it. There was a difference, and the difference was the whole point. He cleaned it so a person could see exactly what it was, and not one thing more. The crack in the windshield stayed. The tear along the seam of the driver's seat, where Walter had gotten in and out of the car 10,000 times, stayed. The 3 scratches raked across the right rear panel stayed the ones Joel could date without checking, because the logbook had dated them for him in Walter's hand. Road America, August of 1987. He cleaned around all of it. He worked the grime back from the edges of every mark so that they stood out sharper than before, not softer. He wasn't hiding the car's history. He was making sure no one could miss it. September came back around to the morning Joel had been moving toward all along, though he hadn't known it until now. Richmond before 6 o'clock has a light all its own. It comes in low and spread thin, and for a little while it turns everything the color of amber, before the day burns it off into something ordinary. The transport truck stood on the gravel with its ramp down, and Joel brought the Corvette up it, the way he did everything slow, exact, no wasted motion, the engine turning over under him one last time, with the sound Walter had built into it, and no one else had ever quite been able to hear. When the motor went quiet, Joel climbed down. He set both hands flat on the roof of the car and ran them once from the front of it to the back, slow the way you'd settle a hand on the shoulder of someone you were sending, somewhere you couldn't follow. Then he stepped back down the ramp. Claire stood in the open doorway of the garage watching. "He'd be proud," she said. Joel didn't answer right away. He stood looking at the car through the side window of the truck, waiting, while the crew ran the straps and worked down the line of latches, and he didn't speak until the last one was cinched tight and the car was held. "I know," he said, and this time he did. For 8 years he'd have heard those words and wanted to believe them and not quite managed it. Now they came out plain and steady because a man who'd won everything there was to win in that sport had driven 300 miles to read him a sentence in Walter's own hand, and because Joel had finally understood the thing, Walter left him to figure out alone why it mattered, and so at last, what to do. The ramp came up. The truck pulled away off the gravel and out onto the road, and it took the bend slow under its weight and went behind the line of trees, and then the sound of it was gone too. The garage behind Joel felt larger than it had in 8 years. With the corner empty and the tarp folded away for good, the morning light came in through the open front and ran all the way to the back wall without a single thing to stop it. Joel stood in the doorway with a wrench still in his hand, the way he always seemed to be holding one, and he looked out at the empty road a while longer. Then he turned back inside to the Mustang on the lift and to the next thing that needed listening to.